Hello everyone, my name is Professor Jason Gulia and I teach in the English department here at Berkeley College. I'm actually just going to talk for a few minutes about the difference between real news and fake news. The first thing I want to talk about is just how important this conversation is right now. At this moment, the vast majority of us get our information not from a newspaper or even from a television news network, but from the internet. More and more stories are being shared on social media sites like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and whatever other ones we use on a regular basis. So right now, it is becoming more and more difficult to figure out what the distinction is between fake news and real news. And as we move forward and as technology progresses, this conversation will continue to change. It is evolving. A lot of the ways that we are sharing news stories now are relatively new, and there's very little oversight right now. All right, the second thing I want to talk about before even defining fake news is what it isn't. At this moment, many politicians describe any news story that disagrees with them as fake news. Now, right off the bat, that is not what fake news is. So fake news is not a story that disagrees with you or that takes an opposing viewpoint. Fake news is also not just inaccurate news. Now, often, even in newspapers, individual journalists might publish a story that has some inaccuracy, whether it's a statistic being reported incorrectly or an event being reported incorrectly. Now, newspapers for a very, very long time, and they still do, have sometimes published retractions. Now, these are where they revise the story, so it's been reported to them that something is inaccurate, and then they backtrack and they're able to say, we should have published this, or we should have read this. All right, so again, fake news is not news that disagrees with your perspective, and it is not necessarily just inaccurate news. All right, so that's what fake news isn't. Now let's talk a little bit about what fake news is. Fake news is actually something very, very specific. So fake news, and I'm going to take this definition from the Cambridge Dictionary. Fake news is false stories that appear to be news, spread on the internet or using other media, usually created to influence a political view or as a joke. There are a couple of parts of this definition that I want to walk us through. The first is that fake news is often to trick us into doing or thinking something. There is a purpose behind it. That purpose can be a joke. It can also be to influence our opinion. So an inaccurate news story is not necessarily fake news. In order for something to be fake news, there needs to be some sort of political or humorous drive behind it. All right, so and the second thing I want to point out about this definition is that intent matters. So fake news has the intent or the meaning of trying to push us in a particular direction. All right, now with that definition in mind, I want to talk pretty quickly about three main tips for seeing the difference between, or identifying the difference between fake news and real news. These three tips are just a tip of the iceberg. They are meant to just give us a very quick sense of how we could distinguish the two, but there are many other ways to do it. So the first tip is when you come across a story online or wherever you come across it, check the source. The internet tricks us into thinking that all information is exactly the same. If I want to find out about a news story, for example, I can go online, I can Google it, and then I can poke around and try to figure out what seems the most accurate or to give me the best information. However, all sources are not created equally. If you go on a website, you may be able to see if it was published by someone who has credentials. So someone who has, say, a PhD in political science or is a political scientist. So you can look at whether the person who wrote it seems trustworthy. You can also poke around and see at the very bottom, usually, where the copyright is from. All right, so websites often have copyrights and they copyright individual stories. So if you see that it is copyrighted by the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or anything like that, you can be pretty secure in the fact that it's accurate. If it is just copyrighted or the source is just some random person that you can't find, it might not be that accurate. All right, so tip number 2 is once you go there, see who else is reporting a story. If you go on Facebook, for example, and you come across a story that is only being reported by one person, there might be a good reason for that. You may not be able to rely on it. Now, so you can go online, you can poke around. If you come across a story, if you're unsure whether it's accurate or not, go look at other news sources. If you start to see that same story or some similar version of the story being published on the New York Times, on CBS, on NBC, then if you see it reported in these different sources, then you can start to feel a little bit more comfortable with the fact that your original news source might be reliable. The third tip is when you are reading through the story, look for evidence. Now, there is a huge difference between a story that cites its evidence as it goes along. So you can get to a paragraph and see that that statistic is coming from blank, right? Whatever seems like a reputable source. Look for that article's use of evidence. So any piece of information that they are taking to support their idea or to support their reporting. Now, you should be able to tell the difference between that sort of article and one that simply throws out an opinion, all right, that doesn't back up the claims with any sort of evidence or any sort of information. So those are the 3 quick tips. Again, they are checking the source. That's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is see who else is reporting the story. This gives you a sense of whether you can rely on the original article or not. And then the third tip is to, as you're reading through the article, look for evidence that supports their argument or their reporting. All right, now those 3 tips basically are a way of making you a more critical reader. Now that information is being spread so quickly and so widely, it makes sense for us to be as skeptical as possible and to have particular strategies for figuring out if something is reliable or not. All right, that's all I wanted to talk about. Hopefully this helps you figure out the difference between the two. And again, it is a constantly changing conversation that will continue to evolve as we move forward with technology.